I was never particularly cautious about my online presence. Like most people, I use social media to keep in touch with friends, share updates, and occasionally post photos. But everything changed when I started receiving messages from an anonymous account. At first, it seemed harmless enough, just the occasional comment or direct message. I didn't think much of it. The messages started out innocuously, commenting on my posts or asking questions about places I had been. They were phrased politely, almost as if the sender was trying to engage in friendly conversation. I didn't think much of it until they began to reference personal details about my life, things I hadn't shared publicly. One evening, as I was scrolling through my feed, I received a message from the anonymous account. It read, "I hope you enjoyed the coffee shop you visited yesterday. It looked like a nice place. I hadn't mentioned my visit to the coffee shop online, nor had I shared any photos from that day." The message was unsettling. I tried to ignore it, but the messages continued. They became more intrusive, referencing specific locations I had been to, private conversations I'd had, and even my daily routine. The level of detail was alarming. I began to feel a growing sense of dread every time I checked my messages. I considered reporting the account, but the messages were not overtly threatening, just strangely aware. I hoped that ignoring them would make them go away, but the messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. The sender seemed to know things about me that no one should know, like where I lived, the names of my family members, and even my work schedule. One night, I received a message that made my blood run cold. It read, "I saw you on your way home today. You look tired. I hope you're okay." I hadn't posted about my day or my whereabouts, and the thought of someone watching me in such a personal way was terrifying. I decided to take action. I went through my privacy settings and tightened my social media security. I blocked the anonymous account and reported it to the platform. I hoped that would be the end of it, but the messages didn't stop. They continued to come through from new accounts, each one more insidious than the last. As the weeks went by, the messages started to include more personal and threatening content. One night, I received a message saying, "You should be more careful about where you go. Not everyone is as friendly as you think." The message was accompanied by a photo of my house taken from the street. It was clear that the sender was watching me in real life. The fear was overwhelming. I felt paranoid and vulnerable, constantly looking over my shoulder and double-checking my surroundings. I started changing my routines, avoiding places I used to frequent, and making sure my windows and doors were always locked. Desperate for help, I reached out to the police. They took my case seriously and began investigating, but the anonymous nature of the messages made it difficult to trace the sender. They advised me to document everything and to continue being cautious. I followed their advice, but the sense of dread never left me. One evening, after a particularly unsettling day, I received a new message. "I know it's been hard for you. I've been watching you for a long time, and I understand your fear, but you're not alone. I'm always here." The message was accompanied by a series of photos, images of me walking down the street, leaving my house, and even entering my workplace. The police were able to determine that the photos were taken with a long-range camera, but the sender's identity remained a mystery. The investigation dragged on, and the anonymous messages continued, each one escalating in their intrusiveness and psychological torment. Eventually, the police managed to trace the origin of the messages to a small, unassuming apartment in a nearby town. They conducted a search and found evidence linking the anonymous account to a man named Eric Thompson. He was a reclusive individual with a history of stalking behavior. The investigation revealed that he had been using multiple fake accounts to contact me and was obsessed with watching my every move. Eric was arrested and charged with stalking and harassment. The police informed me that he had been watching me for months, gathering information from my social media profiles and following me in real life. The knowledge that someone had been so deeply invasive and obsessive was chilling. After Eric's arrest, the messages stopped, and I began to feel a sense of relief. However, the experience had left me deeply shaken. I struggled with anxiety and paranoia, constantly on edge and wary of my surroundings. The sense of violation and the feeling of being watched lingered long after the messages had ceased. I took measures to protect my privacy and rebuild my sense of security. I became more cautious about my online presence, avoiding sharing personal details and regularly reviewing my privacy settings. The experience had taught me the importance of online security and the potential dangers of oversharing on social media. To this day, I am still haunted by the experience. The memory of the anonymous messages and the feeling of being watched serve as a constant reminder of the thin line between the digital world and real life. The social media stalker had invaded my privacy in the most unsettling way, and the impact of that invasion remains with me. A dark reminder of the vulnerabilities that come with our connected lives. It was late, far later than I should have been driving. The clock on the dashboard blinked 2:13 a.m. in harsh green numbers, a reminder that I should have been home hours ago. I'd stayed late at the office again, trying to finish up a project that had consumed my life for the past few weeks. By the time I finally left, the streets were empty, the city having long since fallen asleep. The drive home was usually uneventful. A straight shot down the highway followed by a series of winding back roads that led to my house in the countryside. I had driven this route countless times, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with fog, and the darkness seemed to press in on the car, reducing my visibility to just a few feet ahead. The headlights cut through the fog like a knife, but it wasn't enough to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself it was just the late hour and the fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger the farther I drove. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around the car like something alive. I was about halfway home when I saw him. At first, he was just a shape in the distance, barely discernible through the thick fog. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man standing in the middle of the road. He was dressed in dark clothing, almost blending into the night, and he was facing away from me, his back turned as if he hadn't noticed the approaching car. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. What was he doing out here at this hour? There were no houses nearby, no reason for anyone to be walking along this stretch of road in the middle of the night. I stopped the car a few feet away from him, my headlights casting a harsh light on his figure. He didn't move, didn't even seem to register that a car had pulled up behind him. I rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. He just stood there, his head slightly bowed, his hands hanging limply at his sides. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the way he was standing, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to drive away. But I couldn't just leave him there. What if he was hurt? What if he needed help? I hesitated for a moment before deciding to get out of the car. I stepped into the cold night air, the fog wrapping around me like a shroud. The road was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the car's engine. I took a few steps toward the man, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. "Are you okay?" I called out again, trying to keep my voice steady. Still no response. I was close enough now to see the details of his clothing. Dark, worn jeans and a black hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, obscuring his face. He was standing unnaturally still, as if he were a statue rather than a living person. I reached out a hand, intending to tap him on the shoulder, but as my fingers brushed against the fabric of his hoodie, he suddenly moved. He turned to face me, and I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the harsh light of the headlights. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he wasn't really seeing me, but something far beyond. "I'm lost," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me?" There was something about the way he said it, something that sent a jolt of fear through me. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were simply reciting the words rather than actually speaking them. And his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, seemed to bore into me, freezing me in place. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to stay calm. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and I began to wonder if he had even heard me. But then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed down the road in the direction I had been heading. "I need to go that way," he said, his voice still flat, devoid of any emotion. I glanced down the road, peering into the fog. There was nothing out there, just more empty road and darkness. No houses, no signs of life, nothing. I turned back to the man, a sense of unease tightening in my chest. "There's nothing down there," I said, trying to sound rational. "Are you sure that's where you need to go?" He didn't respond. His hand was still outstretched, pointing down the road, but his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was very wrong here. Everything in me was screaming to get back in the car and drive away, to leave this strange man and the unnerving situation behind. But I couldn't just abandon him. What if he really was lost? What if he was in trouble and needed help? I had to at least try to do something. "Okay," I said slowly, keeping my voice calm. "Why don't you get in the car, and I'll drive you down the road. Maybe we can find where you need to go." For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Then, without a word, he lowered his hand and walked past me toward the car. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct was telling me this was a bad idea, but I couldn't turn back now. I got back in the car, glancing in the rearview mirror as the man opened the passenger door and slid into the seat beside me. The interior of the car suddenly felt much smaller, the air thick with an oppressive tension. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me with that same unsettling intensity. I started the car and pulled back onto the road, driving slowly through the fog. The road stretched out ahead of us, disappearing into the mist, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. The man didn't say anything, didn't give any directions, just stared straight ahead with that same vacant expression. After what felt like an eternity, I couldn't take the silence any longer. I glanced over at him, trying to sound casual. "So, where are you headed? Do you live around here?" He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes dark and empty. "I'm going home," he said, his voice flat. I swallowed, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Where's home?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. Again, he didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted back to the road, his expression unreadable. "Just keep driving," he said quietly. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the eerie detachment in his voice. The fog seemed to close in around us, the road narrowing as we drove deeper into the night. The feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing mile until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I kept glancing over at him, hoping for some sign of normalcy, something to reassure me that this was just an ordinary person. But his expression remained blank, his eyes distant. I was beginning to regret my decision to pick him up. Something about this situation felt wrong, deeply wrong, but I didn't know how to extricate myself from it without seeming rude or heartless. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a fork in the road. I slowed down, uncertain which way to go. "Which way?" I asked, my voice betraying my anxiety. The man didn't answer. He just stared ahead as if he hadn't even heard me. I repeated the question, louder this time, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. I was about to make a decision and turn left when he suddenly spoke. "Turn right," he said, his voice cold and commanding. I hesitated for a moment, but then turned the wheel, guiding the car down the right-hand road. The fog was even thicker here, the road barely visible in the headlights. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The tension in the car was unbearable. I wanted to ask him again where we were going, but I was afraid of the answer. I glanced over at him, my heart racing, but he was just staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. We drove in silence for several more minutes, the road winding deeper into the darkness. The unease in my chest had grown into full-blown fear. I didn't know where we were or where we were going, and the man beside me seemed like something out of a nightmare. Finally, the road came to an abrupt end. I stopped the car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The headlights illuminated a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. There was no sign of a house, no sign of life, just an empty, desolate space in the middle of nowhere. "This is it," the man said, his voice eerily calm. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my ears. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling. "There's nothing here." He didn't answer. He just opened the passenger door and stepped out, disappearing into the fog. I watched him go, a sense of dread washing over me. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't just leave him behind. I had to make sure he was okay. I got out of the car and followed him into the clearing. The fog was so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the silence was oppressive, like the world had been muted. I called out to him, but there was no response. The clearing was empty, the man nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. I turned in circles, trying to find any sign of him, but he was gone, vanished into the night. The air was thick with that same sense of wrongness, and I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of the fog. I stumbled back to the car, my heart racing. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I had to get out of there, had to get away from whatever was out there. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but the car wouldn't start. The headlights flickered, then went out, plunging me into darkness. The fog pressed in on all sides, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I was trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to escape. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, the man was still watching, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen with fear, before I finally heard the sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but they grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the car. I couldn't see anything through the fog, but I knew he was there, just outside the window. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the passenger door began to creak open. I screamed, scrambling across the seat, trying to get away, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. The door opened wider, and I felt a cold hand close around my wrist, pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I saw before the fog swallowed me was the man's face, pale and expressionless. his eyes empty as he dragged me into the night. I was never seen again. The basement had always unsettled me. Even as a kid, I never liked going down there. My parents would laugh it off, calling it childish fear, but that feeling never really left me. Now, as an adult, I tried to ignore it, reasoning with myself that it was just a dark, damp space, nothing more. But still, every time I descended those creaky wooden stairs, a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. Last Saturday, I found myself with no choice but to face the basement again. The laundry had piled up, and with a busy week ahead, I knew I couldn't delay it any longer. The weather outside was miserable, cold, dreary, with a steady drizzle tapping against the windows. It was the perfect excuse to stay indoors and catch up on household chores. I grabbed the overflowing laundry basket and headed toward the basement door. The door itself was old, made of heavy wood that groaned when pushed open. It was a door that belonged in an old horror movie, something I would have laughed at had it not been part of my own home. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the sound echoing in the stillness of the basement. I reached the bottom step and hesitated, taking a moment to let my eyes adjust to the dim light. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows, creating dark pockets in the corners of the room where the light didn't quite reach. The concrete floor was cold and slightly damp, and the smell of earth and mildew was stronger than usual. I shivered, attributing it to the chill in the air rather than the unsettling atmosphere. The washing machine and dryer were tucked away in the far corner, next to the old coal chute that had long been sealed up. The chute was a relic from the days when the house was heated by a coal furnace, a reminder of the building's long history. It was nothing more than a bricked-up hole now, but I often found myself glancing at it, as if expecting something to emerge from the dark patch of wall. I started loading the washing machine, trying to shake off the creeping unease. I had just tossed in the last sock when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. I froze, listening intently. It was so soft that I wondered if I had imagined it. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate scraping that seemed to be coming from behind the far wall. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat that had somehow gotten stuck behind the bricks. But deep down, I knew that was unlikely. The house was sealed tight, with no gaps or holes that could lead to the basement walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself to focus on the laundry, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, as if whatever was behind the wall knew I was there and wanted to get my attention. Against my better judgment, I walked over to the wall, the cold concrete sending a chill up my spine as I leaned closer. The scratching continued, steady and relentless. I pressed my ear to the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A weak, rasping voice, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me, please." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the laundry basket. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. Couldn't be real. There was no way someone could be behind that wall. The chute had been sealed up decades ago, long before I even moved into the house. I must have been imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me because of the eerie atmosphere. But the voice was so clear, so desperate. I couldn't just ignore it. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I struggled to explain what I had heard, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. A voice behind the wall. It sounded insane, but the fear in my voice must have been convincing enough, because they said they would send someone over right away. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth in the living room, glancing nervously at the basement door. What if it was some kind of prank? Or worse, what if someone really was trapped down there? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. How could someone be inside the wall of my own house without me knowing? Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, and moments later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find two officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious. I quickly led them down to the basement, my mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. The officers inspected the wall, listening carefully. The scratching had stopped, and the basement was eerily silent. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but they didn't dismiss my concerns outright. Instead, they called for backup, including a demolition team to break through the wall and investigate further. It took them hours to carefully chip away at the bricks, each thud of the hammer echoing in the still basement. I watched anxiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With every brick they removed, my dread grew. What if they found nothing? What if I had imagined the whole thing? But then, as the final bricks were pulled away, the officer closest to the wall recoiled in shock. I stepped closer, peering into the dark space behind the bricks. My stomach turned at the sight. There, wedged into the tiny, claustrophobic space, was a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. He was emaciated, his clothes hanging off him in tatters, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He looked like he had been trapped there for days, maybe even weeks. The paramedics rushed in, carefully extracting the man from the wall. His breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. They quickly placed him on a stretcher and began administering oxygen. But even in his weakened state, he was conscious. His eyes darted around wildly, full of fear and confusion. I wanted to ask him how he had gotten there, why he had chosen my basement of all places, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was too horrified, too stunned by the sight before me. As they prepared to take him to the hospital, one of the paramedics leaned in close, asking the man if he knew who had done this to him. I expected him to say he didn't know, or maybe mention a name that would mean nothing to me. But instead, his eyes locked onto mine, and with a voice that sent a chill down my spine, he whispered, "You." I felt the blood drain from my face. The room spun around me, my mind reeling. It didn't make any sense. How could he say that? I didn't even know this man. I tried to protest, to tell the paramedics that he was delirious, but the look in his eyes was too haunting, too certain. The police didn't know what to make of it, either. They questioned me for hours, asking if I had ever seen the man before, if I had noticed anything strange in the house. I answered as truthfully as I could, but it didn't seem to matter. The man's accusation hung heavy in the air, casting a shadow over everything. The next few days were a blur. The police kept the basement sealed off as they investigated, but they found no evidence to suggest how the man had gotten there. The doctors at the hospital were equally baffled. The man was severely malnourished, on the brink of death, but there were no signs of how he had ended up behind that wall. He never spoke again after that night. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died within days, taking whatever secrets he had with him. The police eventually closed the case, labeling it an unsolved mystery, but I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with trying to understand what had happened. I dug through the house's history, looking for any clue, any connection to the man, but there was nothing. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, only to vanish just as mysteriously. The basement is still there, of course, but I can't bring myself to go down there anymore. The sound of the creaking stairs, the damp smell of the concrete floor, it all brings back the memory of that night, the horror of what I saw behind that wall. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the faint sound of scratching, but I tell myself it's just my imagination. But the worst part, the thing that haunts me more than anything, is the man's final words. You. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that somehow, in some way, he was right. But how? Why would he say that? What had I done? These questions keep me up at night, turning over and over in my mind with no answers in sight. I've considered moving, leaving this house and its dark memories behind, but I know that the guilt, the uncertainty, would follow me wherever I go. I'm trapped in my own prison of doubt and fear, just like that man was trapped behind the wall. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where I belong.